A single map drawn in 1513 references at least 20 source charts that no one has ever found, and every historian who goes looking comes back empty-handed. 20 maps, gone, completely. You've been taught that history is a complete story, that we know what happened, who was there, and when it all went down. School gave you timelines, textbooks gave you dates, and somewhere along the way, you started assuming that the big stuff, the discoveries, the explorers, the moments that shaped the world, had all been accounted for. But here's the problem with that assumption. If 20 maps that could rewrite our entire understanding of ancient exploration can simply vanish without a trace, then the version of history you were handed is missing entire chapters, not footnotes, chapters. And the man at the center of all of it? An Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, a cartographer so precise that 5 centuries after his death, the United States Air Force sat down with his work and couldn't explain how he did it. So who was he? And what exactly did he draw? Piri Reis wasn't a scholar sitting in a library somewhere. He was a naval commander, a man who spent decades on the Mediterranean fighting, mapping, surviving. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was one of the most feared pirates in the Ottoman Empire, and Piri grew up on those ships, not reading about the sea, living on it. By the time he was an adult, he had fought in some of the most decisive naval battles of the 15th and 16th centuries. He served 3 sultans, decades of war, and he never stopped mapping. He rose to become admiral of the fleet in the Indian Ocean, one of the most powerful maritime positions in the world at that time. And in between all of it, he mapped. He didn't just draw coastlines from memory. He was obsessive about sources. He collected charts from captured sailors, from merchants, from Portuguese navigators who had no idea their maps would end up in Ottoman hands. He referenced over 100 source documents for his work. He said so himself in the notes written directly on the 1513 map. One of those sources, he claimed, was a map that had belonged personally to Christopher Columbus. Let that sit for a second. Columbus died in 1506, 7 years before Piri drew his map. And yet somehow, through a Spanish sailor captured at a sea battle off the coast of Valencia in 1501, Piri Reis got his hands on geographic intelligence that Columbus had never made public. That's not a rumor. That's not speculation. Piri wrote it on the map itself. So you have one of the most powerful naval officers in the world, with access to secret charts from the most famous explorer in history, sitting down in 1513 to draw something. The question isn't whether Piri Reis was extraordinary. The question is what he was looking at when he drew, because the map itself, the actual physical object, should not exist. The map is drawn on gazelle skin, not paper, not parchment. Gazelle skin, scraped thin, stretched flat, and then covered edge to edge in coastlines, annotations, and hand-drawn illustrations that have no business being as accurate as they are. It measures roughly 90 by 63 centimeters, about the size of a large poster, and it currently sits in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, where it has been since 1929, the year a librarian named Halil Edhem unrolled it during a routine catalog and stopped breathing for a moment, because what he was looking at made no sense. The western coastline of Africa, accurate. The eastern coastline of South America, accurate. Drawn in 1513, just 2 decades after Europeans first arrived there, with a level of detail that should have taken another century to produce. And then, at the bottom of the map, a landmass, a long, horizontal coastline running across the southern edge of the map. No islands, no guesswork. A continuous continental shelf, drawn with bays and inlets and geographic features that match, with uncomfortable precision, the coastline of Antarctica, officially discovered in 1820. Piri Reis drew it in 1513. Now, the mainstream explanation is that this southern landmass is actually a distorted version of South America, or a representation of the theoretical southern continent that ancient Greek philosophers had predicted must exist for the world to be balanced. That's a legitimate argument. Historians make it. It's not crazy. But here's what that explanation doesn't account for. In 1960, Hapgood submitted the map for formal analysis to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, a unit whose entire job was analyzing geographic and cartographic intelligence. The analysts noted that certain sections of the coastline appeared to match subglacial surveys of Antarctica, surveys conducted using modern equipment that didn't exist until the 1950s. Their report was forwarded up the chain. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer concluded that the southern coastline showed geographic features consistent with subglacial topography, features he stated could not be explained by the cartographic knowledge available in 1513. He didn't say it was proof of anything, but he didn't dismiss it either. And that's the thing about the Piri Reis map that keeps pulling serious researchers back in. It's not one anomaly. It's not one lucky guess. It's a document that is consistently, repeatedly, uncomfortably more accurate than it has any right to be. Which brings us back to the only real question. Where did he get his information? Piri Reis told us exactly where he got his information. That's the part that makes this so frustrating. He didn't hide it. He didn't code it. Right there on the map itself, in his own handwriting, he listed his sources. He referenced Ottoman charts, Portuguese navigation maps, Arabic geographic manuscripts, and then, almost as a footnote, he mentioned that one of his sources was a map drawn by Christopher Columbus, a map that Columbus had used on his first voyage west, a map that no one in 5 centuries of searching has ever located. Think about what that means. Columbus's private navigation charts, the documents that guided the most consequential voyage in recorded history, are simply gone. Not in Spain, not in Portugal, not in any archive, any library, any private collection that researchers have been able to find. The man sailed to the New World and back, and the maps he used to do it have vanished completely. But that's just one of the 20. Peary claimed he synthesized his map from over 100 sources total. Scholars who have studied the 1513 document closely believe that at least 20 of those sources were charts depicting geographic knowledge that had no business existing in 1513, maps showing coastlines that Europeans hadn't reached yet, maps showing land masses that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 3 centuries, and every single one of them is missing, not misplaced, not uncatalogued in some forgotten archive waiting to be found, missing. Researchers have looked, seriously, systematically looked, in Ottoman imperial archives, in Vatican collections, in the private libraries of Portuguese nobility, in the captured document repositories from a dozen different naval powers. Nothing. So you have two possibilities. Either Piri Reis was the greatest cartographic guesser in human history, a man who somehow accurately predicted coastlines, continental shapes, and subglacial geography through sheer intuition and luck. Or he had access to source material that came from somewhere we haven't accounted for, a cartographic tradition older than the one we know about, charts made by people whose names aren't in any history book. Neither answer is comfortable. The first one strains credibility, the second one breaks the timeline, and the academic community, for the most part, has classified the anomalies as explainable. Coincidence, distortion, documents lost to time. Whether that conclusion satisfies you depends on how you weigh the evidence. Piri Reis himself didn't get that luxury. In 1553, at approximately 90 years old, he was beheaded on the orders of the Ottoman Sultan, and whatever he knew died with him. But 40 years after his death, someone else started asking the same questions. Someone with the resources to get answers. And they went straight to the United States military. Everything up to this point could be explained away. Impressive map, missing documents, lost to time, fine. But then the United States Air Force got involved, and that changes the conversation completely. In 1960, a man named Charles Hapgood was writing a book about ancient maps. Hapgood wasn't a fringe researcher. He was a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire, a credentialed academic with a serious reputation, and he had become quietly obsessed with the Piri Reis map, specifically with the southern coastline. Hapgood believed that the geographic features shown at the bottom of the map corresponded too precisely to be coincidence. So he did something unusual. He wrote to the United States Air Force, not a university, not a geography department, the Air Force. He sent the map to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, a unit whose entire job was analyzing geographic and cartographic intelligence. These were not hobbyists. These were professional analysts who spent their careers reading maps for the most powerful military in the world. They wrote back. On July 6, 1960, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer signed a response that has been quoted in academic papers, cited in research journals, and largely ignored by mainstream historians ever since. His conclusion was careful, measured, written in the precise, non-committal language of a military officer who understood exactly what he was putting on paper. He confirmed that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map showed geographic features consistent with the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Features that had only been mapped using modern seismic survey equipment in the 1950s. Features he stated could not be explained by the cartographic knowledge available in 1513. Read that again. A United States Air Force officer, after formal analysis by a professional cartographic unit, looked at a map drawn 5 centuries ago and said, "We cannot explain this." He didn't claim ancient civilizations. He didn't claim time travel. He made no dramatic conclusions whatsoever. He simply stated, in an official military document, that the data didn't fit the timeline. And then nothing happened. No follow-up investigation. No declassified research program. No official academic response. The letter was filed. Hapgood published his book. A few researchers cited it. And the map went back on display in Istanbul, behind glass, where tourists photograph it every day without knowing what they're actually looking at. The U.S. Air Force couldn't explain it. So what exactly are we supposed to do with that? Let's assume, for a moment, that the map is exactly what it appears to be, that the southern coastline is Antarctica, that the accuracy isn't coincidence, that the 20 missing source maps existed, real documents drawn by real people, containing real geographic knowledge that shouldn't have existed in 1513. If that's true, then the question isn't about Piri Reis anymore. The question is about whoever made those source maps, because Piri Reis was a compiler. He said so himself. He took existing charts and synthesized them into something new, which means if his sources showed Antarctica, showed it accurately, with subglacial features and correct continental proportions, then somebody mapped it before him. Somebody who had ships capable of reaching the Southern Ocean. Somebody who had the navigational technology to chart a coastline in conditions that would have been genuinely lethal. Somebody whose name appears nowhere in any history book we have. Hapgood's theory, and he was careful to frame it as a theory, was that certain ancient maps preserve geographic knowledge from a civilization that predated the ones we know about. Not aliens, not magic. A human civilization, technologically sophisticated, that mapped significant portions of the Earth during a period we currently classify as prehistoric. His most controversial claim was the timeline. Antarctica, as we know it today, is buried under ice. The subglacial coastline that the Piri Reis map appears to show, the one that matches modern, seismic surveys, would only have been visible before the Antarctic ice sheet reached its current depth. Hapgood argued, citing certain glaciological studies, that the subglacial coastline shown would only have been accessible before the ice sheet reached its current depth, a claim mainstream geology strongly disputes. Read that number again, 4000 BC, before the pyramids, before writing, before everything we call civilization. Now, mainstream geology pushes back on Hapgood's timeline, hard. The scientific consensus on Antarctic glaciation doesn't support the idea of an ice-free coastline within human historical memory. That's a real objection. It matters. And it means Hapgood's theory, in its most dramatic form, has serious problems. But here's what the objection doesn't resolve. It doesn't explain the map. It doesn't account for the accuracy. It doesn't tell us where the 20 source charts went or who made them. Dismissing Hapgood's conclusion doesn't make the underlying data disappear. The Air Force letter still exists. The map still exists. The missing sources are still missing. Think about what you're being asked to choose between. Either Piri guessed, or someone mapped the world before history says it was possible. Neither answer is comfortable. And there is one more detail, sitting right there on the map itself, in Piri's own handwriting, that almost nobody talks about. Something he wrote in the margins. Something that changes the entire framing of what this document actually is. When historians first studied the 1513 map seriously, they focused on the coastlines. That's understandable. The coastlines are the anomaly. The coastlines are what triggered the Air Force letter and the academic debates and the decades of back and forth about Antarctica and ancient civilizations and how much a 16th century Ottoman admiral could have known. But Piri Reis didn't just draw coastlines. He wrote on the map, extensively, in Ottoman Turkish, in a careful hand, in notes that run along the margins and fill the empty ocean spaces between the continents. Notes that most Western researchers didn't engage with seriously until relatively recently. Partly because of the language barrier, partly because the coastlines were the more dramatic story, and partly, perhaps, because of what the notes actually say. Piri wrote about his sources in detail. He described the Columbus map specifically, noting that it had been taken from a Spanish sailor captured during a naval engagement and that it showed land masses that Columbus himself may not have fully understood. Peary wrote that Columbus had used this map on his western voyage, and that it showed land masses Columbus himself may not have fully understood. What that something was, Peary doesn't fully explain. He moves on. The way a man moves on when he's decided some things don't need to be written down. But he goes further. He writes that several of his source charts were described in translation as very ancient. Not old, ancient. He distinguishes between the contemporary Portuguese and Ottoman charts he used, which he describes matter-of-factly, and a separate category of sources that he treats with a different kind of weight. Sources he describes as coming from a time before the current understanding of the world. In his own words, on his own map, Piri Reis acknowledged that some of what he was drawing came from somewhere older than anything his contemporaries recognized. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain where those ancient charts came from or how they reached him. He simply noted their existence. incorporated their data, and moved on, and then consider what happened to him. This man, admiral of the fleet, three-time servant of Ottoman sultans, the most accomplished cartographer of his age, was executed in 1553 at approximately 90 years old, not in battle, not from illness. He was beheaded on orders from above for reasons that historical records describe vaguely as military and administrative failures in a naval campaign near Basra. Maybe that's exactly what it was. A 90-year-old admiral who made a strategic mistake and paid for it. Maybe the most dangerous thing Piri Reis ever produced wasn't a military decision. Maybe it was a document. We don't know. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this story impossible to close. So here's the official answer, the one you'll find in academic journals, in university history departments, in the standard academic narrative that has largely held since Hapgood's work was reviewed and disputed in the 1960s. The Piri Reis map is remarkable but explainable. The southern landmass is probably a distorted representation of South America, or a depiction of the theoretical continent ancient philosophers predicted. The accuracy of certain coastlines is impressive, but not impossible given the sources available in 1513. The missing charts are simply lost, simple, clean, resolved. Victims of war, fire, time, and the general chaos of 5 centuries of human history. The Air Force letter is interesting but inconclusive. Hapgood's theory has been largely rejected by mainstream geology. Case closed. That's the resolution. And here's the thing, it's not entirely wrong. Serious historians make serious arguments for every one of those points. The distortion explanation has genuine merit. The lost to time argument is statistically reasonable. Most documents from that era are gone. The geological objections to Hapgood are real and they matter. But resolution isn't the same as explanation, because here is what the official answer cannot tell you. It cannot tell you why a map drawn in 1513 consistently surprises modern cartographers with its accuracy. It cannot tell you where Columbus's private navigation charts went. It cannot tell you what Piri Reis meant when he described sources that were, in his own words, very ancient. It cannot explain why a United States Air Force cartographic unit looked at this document with professional eyes and said, the data doesn't fit. It cannot tell you what those 20 missing maps showed. And it cannot tell you, not really, not satisfyingly, why every historian who pulls this thread seriously ends up in the same place, staring at a piece of gazelle skin, wondering, remember where we started, a single map referencing 20 source charts that no one has ever found. Every historian who goes looking comes back empty-handed. That hasn't changed. What has changed, what always changes when you look at this closely enough, is the weight of the question. It stops being an academic curiosity. It starts being something personal. Because if 20 maps containing knowledge we can't account for simply vanished from history, then the story of how we got here, how humans went from scattered settlements to global civilization, has a gap in it, a deliberate gap or an accidental one. Either answer should bother you. Here's what we actually know. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis drew a map on gazelle skin that has never been fully explained. He drew it using sources he listed by name, sources that included Columbus's private charts and at least 20 other documents that have never been found. A United States Air Force unit analyzed it in 1960 and formally stated that certain features cannot be explained by the knowledge available in 1513. Piri himself wrote in his own hand that some of his sources were described in translation as very ancient, older than anything his contemporaries recognized, and then he was beheaded, and the maps disappeared. That's not a theory, that's not speculation, that's the documented, verified on the record history of a single piece of gazelle skin sitting in a museum in Istanbul right now. You can go see it today. It's there. The question of what it means, of who made those ancient source charts, of where they went, of what civilization produced geographic knowledge that shouldn't have existed. That question is still open. It has been open for 5 centuries. And the reason it stays open isn't because no one is smart enough to answer it. It's because the answer requires admitting that the timeline we've been given has holes in it. Big ones. If this kind of buried history interests you, the things that don't fit, the documents that disappeared, the questions that institutions stopped asking, then stick around. Because this is one thread in a much longer story, and the next one goes somewhere even the historians don't like to look. Subscribe if you want to follow it. And if you know someone who still thinks the official version of history is the complete version, send them this video. Not to argue, not to convince, just to ask the same question that's been sitting unanswered for 500 years. Where did those 20 maps go?